It's 4 in the morning in a farmhouse in Austria. Outside, it's 15 degrees. The fire in this stove went out at 9 o'clock last night, 7 hours ago. Nobody has touched it since. Open the door and there's nothing in there but gray ash. No embers, no glow, nothing. And the room is still 70 degrees. There's no thermostat in this house, no furnace, no gas line running in from the road. There's a stack of stone in the corner, and it's doing all the work. Across the coldest parts of Europe, this has been normal for 400 years. You light one fire, you let it burn hot, and then you let it die. And the house stays warm long after the flame is gone. 12 hours, sometimes closer to a full day. Not a fire you tend, a fire you finish. Now here's the part I couldn't get past. If that works, if it really works the way people say it does, why isn't there one in your house? Why can't you walk into a builder's office in Ohio, or Pennsylvania, or Minnesota, and point at one in a catalog? Why is there no version of this at your local home center, sitting on a pallet next to the wood stoves? And why did your grandfather's cast iron stove need feeding at 3 in the morning, when a farmer in Sweden slept straight through? I want to be clear about something up front, because you've probably seen videos on this subject that go a certain direction. It wasn't banned. It wasn't hidden. Nobody buried it to protect a business. The real answer is stranger than that. And honestly, it's more useful. It starts with a country that was running out of trees. The fuel crisis that built it. To understand why this thing exists, you have to understand that it was never invented for comfort. It was invented because Europe was running out of forest. From roughly 1300 to 1850, Northern Europe went through a long stretch of unusually cold weather. Historians call it the Little Ice Age. Winters got harder, growing seasons got shorter, and the cold lasted long enough that it shaped how people built. In Scandinavia and northern Germany, communities were burning through their woodlands to survive those winters, and not just for heat. Wood was also going into iron smelting, into shipbuilding, into everything an early modern economy ran on. The pressure on the forests was real, and people at the time knew it. So they had a problem that any heating engineer today would recognize instantly. The open hearth, the one in every painting from that era, the one we now think of as cozy, is a terrible machine. Most of the heat it produces goes straight up the chimney. Only a small fraction of it ever reaches the person sitting in front of it. And it's worse than that, because a fireplace has to pull air from somewhere to feed the fire. It takes the warm air out of your room and sends that up the chimney too. On a cold night, an open fireplace can leave the far side of the room colder than when you started. So there they were, freezing inside their own houses while burning the forest down around them. In 1767, the Swedish crown decided this had become a national problem worth solving and commissioned an answer to it. The man who delivered it was an architect named Carl Johan Cronstedt, working alongside Fabian Reda. What they built was tall, tiled, and heavy. And inside it, the smoke didn't go straight up. It was forced through a long folded path, channels running back and forth through the body of the stove, before it was allowed to leave the building. That stove is called the Kakelung, and once it existed, it spread. The German and Austrian version is the Kachelofen, the tiled stove, with roots going back centuries earlier than that. In Russia, the Pechka, some of them big enough that the family slept on top. In Finland, they built theirs out of soapstone. Different countries, different tiles, different names, same idea underneath. And that idea barely changed for the next 250 years, which should tell you something. A design that survives that long, essentially unchanged, across that many borders, isn't a folk curiosity, it's a solved problem. So, what replaced it? We'll get there. But first you need to understand what actually happens inside one of these things, because it's almost the exact opposite of what most people assume. Here's the first thing that surprises people. You don't keep the fire going. Think about how you'd use a normal wood stove. last through the night, so you close the air down. You choke it. You make it smolder. It feels efficient. It isn't. When you starve a fire of air, the temperature drops, and at low temperature, wood doesn't burn completely. It releases smoke. And here's the thing about smoke. Smoke isn't waste. Smoke is fuel that never got hot enough to ignite. You bought that wood. You split it. You stacked it. You dried it for a year. And then you watch a good portion of it drift out of your chimney as a gray cloud. Along with the creosote, it leaves coating the inside of the flue on the way out. A masonry heater does the exact opposite. Full air, maximum temperature. One short, ferocious burn, usually an hour or two. And then you let it go out completely. Burn hot enough, and something useful happens. The smoke itself catches fire before it can escape. Almost everything in that wood gets converted into heat inside the firebox, instead of leaving as pollution. That's step one. Burn hot, not long. Now step two. And this is where the design gets genuinely clever. In an ordinary stove, all the heat you just made goes up and out in a matter of seconds. That's the chimney's entire job. Get rid of it. In a masonry heater, the chimney is the point. The hot gas leaving that firebox is forced through the folded path we talked about. Up, across, down, across again, through tons of masonry. And every foot it travels, it gives up more of its heat to the stone around it. By the time that gas finally reaches the outside air, it's given away most of what it was carrying. So where did all that energy go? Into the wall of the thing. And that brings us to the last piece. Masonry is very good at two things at the same time. It absorbs a great deal of energy before its own temperature rises much. And it's slow to let that energy back out. Think about the difference between a metal pan and a stone. Take both off the stove at the same moment. The pan is cool enough to touch in about a minute. The stone is still warm an hour later. Same heat going in. Completely different behavior coming out. That's the whole machine. Burn hot to capture everything. Route the exhaust through mass to store it. Then let it come back out on its own schedule. Over hours. No thermostat. No fan. No electronics. No moving parts to fail. And the heat you feel from it isn't blown at you. It radiates. It works the way sunlight through a window warms your skin before it warms the air in the room. Which is why people describe the warmth from these as feeling different, and why they'll sit against one for an hour. So, everything I've just described makes this sound like an obviously better machine. It isn't. And the reasons it isn't are exactly the reasons it lost. Does it actually do 24 hours? But before we get there, we should deal with the number in the title, because that claim gets thrown around a lot, and it deserves an honest look. 24 hours. Is that real, or is it marketing? Here's the first thing to understand. It does not mean the house sits at 70 degrees for a full day and then falls off a cliff at hour 25. What it actually means is that the mass keeps giving off usable heat between firings. So a household fires the stove once, maybe twice a day, instead of tending a fire continuously. That's the real claim. And that part is true. It's simply how these homes are run, and it's how they've been run for centuries. But how long the heat lasts depends on things that vary enormously from one installation to another. The mass of the heater is the big one. More stone, more storage. A 2-ton heater and a 4-ton heater behave very differently. Then the building itself. A tight, well-insulated house holds on to what the stove gives it. A drafty old farmhouse with single-pane windows doesn't. You're heating the outdoors, and no stove fixes that. Then the weather, the wood you burned, and how dry it was, and the layout of the rooms. So, is 24 hours true? Under good conditions, a large heater, a tight house, a moderate winter. Yes, meaningful heat is still coming off that stone a full day later, at -20, in a leaky building with a small heater. No, not close. The honest number for most real installations sits somewhere around 12 to 18 hours, with 1 or 2 firings a day, which, if you you have ever gotten out of a warm bed at 3 in the morning to put another log in a stove is the entire point. What it costs you now, the trade-offs. And these are not small. Start with weight. A masonry heater weighs somewhere between 1 and 4 tons, sometimes more. That's not furniture. That's a structural element of the building. It needs its own foundation, or a floor specifically engineered to carry it, which rules out most retrofits, nearly every upper floor, and almost every apartment in existence. Then there's skill. You can't buy one in a box and assemble it on a Saturday. Building one properly is a specialist trade. In German-speaking Europe, there's a name for the person who does it: the Hafner, the stove setter. It's a real apprenticeship, and it takes years. In most of the United States, you would struggle to find someone qualified within 100 miles of your house. That skill costs money. A professionally built masonry heater is a serious construction expense. It belongs in the same conversation as a major renovation, not the same conversation as buying a wood stove. Then there's speed, or rather, the complete absence of it. You cannot make this thing warmer right now. Come home to a cold house on a Friday night, and you're looking at hours before that stone starts delivering. There's no dial. There's no thermostat. There's no right now. The stove operates on its own time scale, and you arrange your life around it rather than the other way around. And radiant heat doesn't turn corners. In one big open room with high ceilings, it's superb. In a 4-bedroom house with closed doors, hallways, and a finished basement, the far rooms stay cold. Walls block radiant heat the same way they block sunlight. And finally, you still do the work. Cutting, splitting, stacking, drying, carrying it in. Every day, all winter, for as long as you live there. So here's the honest comparison. A furnace asks nothing of you but money. This asks for a foundation, a mason, a wood pile, and a routine. That is not a small difference. That's a different way of living in a house. So, heavy, slow, expensive, needs a specialist, and it only properly heats one part of your home. That should be the end of the story, except it isn't, because in one part of Europe, people kept building them anyway. And that's the clue that solves this whole thing. Why the West walked away. Here's what actually happened. It wasn't one decision. It was a chain of them, and each link made the next one inevitable. 1. Fuel got cheap. Coal first, then oil, then gas. Now think about what the masonry heater was actually for. It was engineered from the very beginning to solve exactly one problem: getting the maximum possible heat out of the minimum possible wood, because wood was scarce and expensive, and the forests were disappearing. When fuel became cheap and abundant, that advantage stopped being worth anything at all, and everything else follows from that. 2. Central heating separated the fire from the room. One boiler in the basement could warm an entire building, every room, at once, evenly, including the ones nobody was sitting in. A masonry heater warms the room it stands in. Against a system that could serve a whole house from a closet, it lost on architecture alone, before cost or convenience even entered the argument. 3. Houses changed shape. People moved into cities, into apartments, into buildings with lighter floors and smaller subdivided rooms. And a modern floor frame often physically cannot carry 2 tons of stone. Not shouldn't, cannot. 4. Convenience became the actual product. The thermostat sold something stone can never offer: instant, adjustable, unattended. You set a number and you walk away. No fire to build, no wood to carry, no routine to keep. For a generation that had spent their entire lives hauling fuel, that wasn't a small upgrade. It felt like freedom. 5. The trade shrank. Fewer commissions meant fewer apprentices. Fewer apprentices meant fewer masons. Fewer masons meant fewer commissions, because you can't order something if there's nobody left who can build it. Once that loop starts turning, it's very hard to reverse. 6. War, and what came after. Enormous amounts civilian housing were destroyed in the middle of the 20th century and rebuilt at extraordinary speed. Rebuilt with modern systems, because when a country needs housing now, speed and cost decide everything, and craft traditions don't get a vote. Now, I said at the start that I'd be straight with you about this. You will find people claiming this technology was deliberately suppressed, that the heating industry buried it to protect its business model. I went looking for evidence of that. I didn't find any. And the truth is less satisfying, but I think it's a lot more interesting. Nobody killed it. It was outcompeted by cheap oil. And cheap oil doesn't need a conspiracy to win an argument. It just needs to stay cheap. Which brings me to the thing I've been holding back since the beginning. The question in the title of this video contains a mistake. The twist: Europe didn't stop. Right now, today, masonry heaters are being designed, built, and installed across Austria, Germany, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. Not preserved, not restored, not kept alive in a museum by enthusiasts, built by working masons for new houses this year. In Finland, soapstone heaters are a modern manufacturing industry with factories and engineers and export markets. That's not heritage craft, that's a product line. And the designs have moved on too. Contemporary combustion engineering, glass doors, so you can actually watch the burn. Built to current building standards, in houses that look nothing like an 18th century farmhouse. It isn't even unknown in North America. There's an industry association here for exactly this, and a published construction standard for building them properly. It's just that almost nobody knows that. So the question was never why Europe stopped. Europe didn't stop. The real question is why this never crossed the Atlantic. And the answer is that it arrived at exactly the wrong moment. At a point in history when America had something Europe didn't: cheap fuel, cheap land, and forest that seemed like it would never end. Nobody here needed to squeeze 18 hours of heat out of a single armload of wood. You could just burn more wood. The technology was never rejected in America. It simply never had a problem to solve. The bigger story. Step back far enough, and this stops being about stoves at all. Every heating system is an argument about how a house should work. A furnace says, heat is a service, delivered on demand, forever, for a fee. Something you buy, continuously, from somebody else, for as long as you live in the building. A masonry heater says something different. It says heat is a thing you make once and keep. One of those optimizes for convenience. The other optimizes for fuel. And for almost all of human history, fuel was the scarce thing. Houses were designed around that fact. Thick walls, small windows, mass at the center of the building. Every decision shaped by the cost of staying warm through a winter. Then, for about 70 years, fuel stopped being scarce, and we redesigned everything around convenience instead. That's the whole story. That's the entire answer to the question in the title. And 70 years is not very